You look statistically, and the data says the economy is recovering, all this stuff, but there is this uncertainty. And I think and I know you're going to be hearing talks about some of this uncertainty, and you heard it before, but I sort of pinpoint it, and I look at it. My dad was born and raised in a town called Waterloo, Iowa. And Waterloo, probably best to be described, it's not a small town, a sort of small city. I think at one time it was Iowa's second largest city. It's probably the third largest city now after Cedar Rapids. And Waterloo's economy when my father was growing up was a meatpacking plant, Raft meatpacking plant, and John Deere. Two big engines. There were some other parts of the city's economy. And you look now, and there's no meatpacking plant anymore at all. John Deere's footprint has shrunk. They make a ton. They make more tractors today than they did 40 years ago when he was living there. But they make more of them in China. And frankly, you understand why they do. They sell more tractors in China, so they make those tractors in China. It makes perfect sense. They sell fewer in the United States, and they make fewer in the United States. But Waterloo hasn't found that sector to sort of replace those middle-class jobs. Instead, I think the best job, the best new jobs that showed up there in the last decade was a casino. We know those are hourly wages. That's not necessarily a get up the economic ladder. There's the University of Northern Iowa, and that's really what's happened to a lot of these middle-sized, large towns and small cities, geographically really in the middle of America. Where folks are it's not clear what is the next thing that is going to be the backbone of the American economy, right? What are we going to make next? So that's where this anxiety comes from. And the other part of it is there's clearly two economies. We talk about income inequality, and you're going to hear that a lot. But to me, it's this economic anxiety because you do have sort of two perceptions of the economy. On the fives, if you look at it on the old interstate map, along I-5 from San Diego to Seattle, or along I-95 from Miami to Boston, things are cooking. Things are in good shape. Cities are revitalizing. You're seeing city economies grow. You're seeing real jobs being created. In between the fives is where there's the anxiety, right? And it's also where there's the disconnect. This is where we did a horrible job in the media covering the Great Recession. I don't think to this day we still understand the depths of the Great Recession for people that were living in the Waterloo, Iowas of the world, or the Muncie, Indianas. Because we were in a bubble in Washington where the economy was insulated. We didn't have a dip. Okay, so housing prices slowed down. They only went up 2%. They didn't go up 10%, type of thing. That was the dip that took place in sort of Washington. New York, same way. Yes, we saw the Wall Street money go up and down, but the economy didn't really experience a recession in the New York. And so here you have the media capital of the world and the political capital of the world not experiencing what the rest of America was experiencing firsthand. When you have firsthand, now just look at the way we're covering the train derailment. We're covering this train derailment so well. Why? Because we all take that train. Okay? It is, if this, I hate to be this crass, but if this train derailment took place from St. Louis to Chicago, we'd cover it, but with more distance. You'd feel that perceived distance and all this stuff. So when something happens to us and it happens to then we cover it with this extra passion sometimes where it feels. So on the economy, we didn't feel the recession, and so we always covered it statistically. We didn't really cover it, and so we have not covered the recovery very well. So this to me, that's the big number one. That's the big economic challenge. The other big issue is global insecurity. Right? We have this it's not perception, right? The world feels as if it's never been more chaotic, and it's never felt closer to us than ever before. Right? We feel like we see the chaos firsthand all the time, whether it's a YouTube video or something on social media or something bigger than that. And look, this is a huge challenge for the next president. I think if you'd have told me that Barack Obama's presidency would be ending and the Middle East would be in more chaos than it was when he took office, I don't think anybody would have thought that was going to be the case. We just didn't think it could get worse. Now, there's going to be a whole debate about whether, did he have a hand in that, or do we have a larger issue here? I kind of think I think you can pick apart some of the decisions that he made, and whether it's Libya and some of these other decisions. There's also the big decision that started the chaos in the first place, the Iraq War. But there's also this move of technology. One of the things that I think makes American foreign policy harder to conduct today than ever before is, when people talk about the way Congress used to work, and I'm going to get into that in a minute, it used to be you essentially could buy votes, right? The good old days of being able to horse trade. And, you've seen the movie Lincoln, right? You couldn't have done that today. Essentially, Lincoln bought the 13th Amendment, okay? And he promised jobs and all this stuff, which is the way we conducted a lot of politics, I would say, through the 80s. Now, of course, with transparency, that's a very much a taboo. Well, American foreign policy, I was talking to the former Secretary of State, Jim Baker, will say this, he doesn't criticize other people's struggle to put coalitions together, international coalitions there. He had it easy in the late 80s and early 90s because you could buy allies. Oh, Saudi Arabia, how many fighter jets do you need? Here you go. UAE, what do you need? Here you go. And essentially, that's the way American foreign policy worked. It is much harder for us to conduct foreign policy that way anymore, right? Because we have this new, we don't accept it as an American public. We don't like that idea that, that will essentially use taxpayer money to sort of create an ally. And vice versa. It's much harder for the other countries to be seen as doing this. It's all out in the open. And so, look, I think we haven't figured out how to, I think, this new style of how you conduct American foreign policy in this new day and age of instant transparency, and the fact that the public will have visceral reactions of what you're doing on things that used to be you didn't see before. It was totally end justify the means type of diplomacy. Never mind the challenge that I think the next president's going to have with what is America? How does America conduct itself as a superpower? Can it? Does it have the influence it can have anymore? And then so that's a giant umbrella challenge. The third big issue is the one I want to spend the most time on today, which is the broken political system. And my concern is that this, to me, you can't deal with the economic anxiety issue. You can't deal with the global insecurity issue if you don't have a functioning political system. And it's not a sexy issue, and the presidential candidates aren't going to touch it. But the fact is, everybody acknowledges it's not working. I wish I could tell you there's one reason it's not working, but it is a collection of reasons. There's a great essay that has been very influential in my thinking on this called America in Decay. It's by a political scientist named Francis Fukuyama. It's in one of these political science quarterlies. And in fact, I subscribe to all this stuff, and I have it on my bedside table. Literally, it stacks up. I only read it a couple months ago. It was out in like last summer's edition of Foreign Affairs Quarterly, but it's like, the way you catch up on reading. And it was the best diagnosis of trying to explain sort of how did we get to this place where essentially we have this political gridlock. And, some people want to say it's gerrymandering, some people want to say it's money, and some people want to say it's the lobbyist issue, some people's turmoil. He outlines it in a number of ways. And he starts with an anecdote, it's very interesting, on the Forestry Service. He starts 100 years ago, and he goes, when we first started the Forestry Service, they would only hire people who were experts in forestry. Go figure. It makes perfect sense, right? You're starting the Forestry Service, you want to have people who are working in the Forestry Service. And at the time, there was an epidemic of wildfires out west. This is late 19th century. And, there was concern, how are we going to protect land? Well, later on, they'd find out, well, some wildfires are important. You do need them, But it was, for 30 years, it was considered one of the model government agencies. It was stacked with experts in the field. Today, 40% of all hires at the Forestry Service have to be veterans, regardless of their qualification. This is not a judgment on veterans. But the point is, what he was using it as an example of what happens. We've created these large bureaucracies, and congressional mandates get put on them. And all of them that get put on these different agencies are done with the best of intentions, right? 40% of new hires at the Forestry Service should be veterans. That's a law of good intention. But are you going to have experts in forestry? Like, shouldn't that still be priority one and things like that? Then he gets into the issue of special interest, which to me, I think is sort of the thread. If you were to tell me what's truly wrong with Washington, it all is on this one street called K Street. And it's all around the special interests. And when you realize the enormous power that they have in how now you actually have governing and legislation written around them. You know, the healthcare law is a great example. In 1993 and 94, when the Clinton administration tried to do healthcare reform, it basically was defeated by one industry, the insurance industry. They didn't like it, and boy, if you remember, they were called the Harry and Louise ads, and it was all funded by the insurance company trade association. So essentially, Rahm Emanuel, when he was chief of staff, and I go through this in the book pretty closely, it was all about learning the lessons of what failed during the Clinton years. And they sort of came up with two reasons. Number one was, don't, get the insurance companies on your side. Don't, because they have the power to kill it. And the second was, don't write the law for Congress, let Congress write the law. Obviously, and I won't go down this road, letting Congress write the law, I think in hindsight, turned out to be a disaster politically. But they wrote the law in a way that pleased the insurance companies. So when you write a whole new law around an industry, does that mean it was the best idea, or is the best idea that they could get through around a special interest? It's like they weren't worried about winning Republican support, they were worrying about winning industry support. And the thing is I'm not trying to just pick on the Obama administration here. This has been happening now for 20 years, where the interest groups are so powerful, they literally now write legislation to avoid the ire of some of these special interest groups. The reason we don't have tax reform is because of the realtors. Because you can't do tax reform if you don't mess around with the mortgage deduction. Okay? It has to be in play. The numbers don't, if you want to play all these games of lowering rates, simplifying the code, a lot of it is going to have to come from somehow putting a cap on the mortgage tax deduction and all this stuff. But it is such a perceived, it's such a very popular, obviously, tax deduction, that a special interest can just take that, even if they are overall lowering taxes for you, but they can turn that into an ad campaign that says they want to raise taxes on your mortgage. They want to tax your mortgage, or they want to tax it up. And it's essentially made it so that none of these tax reform proposals have been taken seriously, because you can't have that, and you have this special interest issue. And let me just put it into numbers here a little bit. 1971, there were 175 registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C. 535 members of Congress. Not a bad ratio. In 2009, there were 13,500 registered lobbyists. By the way, there's still 535 members of Congress. We're outnumbered, okay? I mean, you almost feel sorry for the members of Congress. I say almost. I'm sure you know. But they're totally outnumbered here. And then you get to the issues of like, it is the norm that now people go to Capitol Hill, work for an influential committee for a couple of years, and then go to K Street, get paid 10 times what they were making, and suddenly lobby their old boss. It's that in itself, it is it's legal political corruption. And every once in a while it gets so bad that it does cross the line, and we've had various things, if you remember the Jack Abramoff thing, but we've had various things that have actually jumped too far into the scandal realm. But that part of it is perfectly legal, and you say to yourself, this is a warped system where the member of Congress will see their senior staff, who they were bosses to, suddenly, and then think about how that changes the psyche of the member. They sit there and they see this kid that they pulled out of obscurity, who was a great driver for them, say, during the campaign, and, you know, moved up the office and all this stuff, and suddenly they're making 10 times what they make, and look, we're all human, right? It has its own, and I think it does change the mindset a little bit of the elected officials. So I think ultimately you have this issue and sort of the power of these special interests in various forms is something that we have to figure out how to curtail. I'm shocked that there isn't a lifetime ban on members of Congress becoming lobbyists. You know, you could argue that there should be, that if you have a system that makes it so that working on Capitol Hill is a stepping stone to another career, to a career in Washington, that's not going to make for a healthy political system. And what is with the power of the special interest groups? Well, the special interest groups, it's in their nature, and this is where Fukuyama gets into this a little bit more, is their whole focus is they don't want to, essentially they prefer status quo over change. So they're the biggest impediment to change. Because ultimately, you know, they don't want, if anything, if they see change, they only want it to benefit their industry, but they prefer no change. They prefer no touching on what they do, whatever industry it is. And because they're so powerful and because you need so much money to run for office anymore, they become that much more relevant and more powerful. And, you know, it's interesting, and to get really political sciencey here, Fukuyama goes through and he says, you know, Madison, in the original, you know, Federalist Papers, Madison anticipated special interest groups. He knew this would happen. He just assumed they would all be grassroots oriented, number one, and he also assumed that they would all cancel each other out. But I think we've gotten to the form where when you have 13,500 registered lobbyists, they now outnumber the government, right? And they're usually, they actually know more about their industry than the people that are in charge of either regulating them or writing the laws, right? Which is another issue. And that gets us into sort of how do you make government sort of nimble and responsive in the 21st century? And when you read this whole article and you go through it, it's a long 20,000 word deal. You do come to the conclusion that the only way to truly make government nimble enough to be responsive to the needs of sort of modern America is to sunset every government agency every 25 years and force almost a reboot of it every 25 years. Because look at the VA scandal, if you want to call it that. And I say that because it really is a scandal of old infrastructure and old technology and sort of antiquated systems. And by the way, the entire creation of the VA was done, and this gets into another problem that I think our political institutions have, is today's reform is tomorrow's problem. You know, remember, the whole political idea of a political action committee was actually a campaign finance reform idea in 1974, post-Watergate. It was a post-Watergate reform idea. Of course, it turns into it being abused and all this stuff. This seniority system on Capitol Hill, which I think is one of the one of the poorer things that they have, where you become chairman or ranking member, or you're in charge of a committee simply because you were there longer than anybody else, right? Not because you have an expertise in small business. Does that make you a small business chairman of the Small Business Committee, or that you understand Wall Street and you're part of the financial industry and all this stuff. It's simply you were there long enough. Well, that actually happened because 100 years ago you had a Speaker of the House that was only inserting political cronies into all these positions. So at the time, the seniority system was a reform. And this is something that is a recurrence all the time, right? Today's reform, if around long enough, becomes tomorrow's scandal or tomorrow's impediment. And so when you get to this, you know, and you go to, with this issue of Congress, and you know, we've put term limits on committee chairmen, which is on one hand a good idea. On the other hand, it's made the leadership more powerful. Well, when congressional leadership is more powerful, it means all that matters is if you're in power or out of power. The full political, think about this, the last 4 elections, the country has voted for change in some form or another, right? And in its congressional leadership, right? We flipped the House in 06, we flipped it again in 10, we flipped the Senate in 06, we flipped it again in 14. But do you know what stayed the same? Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, John Boehner, and Mitch McConnell. You know, the leaders haven't changed. Their titles did. They had to move offices, so they had to change the nameplate. but they're still in charge, right? The public, they wanted real change, and the leadership doesn't allow Congress to work the way it used to work. I mean, I'll bring back the tax reform example again. The last time we rewrote the tax code in 1986, it was done by the force of nature of Dan Rostenkowski at the time, Democrat, who was heading the tax committee in the House, and Bob Packwood was the Republican heading the committee in charge in the Senate. And the two of them said, we're going to do this, and they did it. About 2 years ago, Max Baucus was the head of the Finance Committee when the Democrats were in charge, and you had a guy named Fred Upton, who was in charge of Ways and Means at the time in the House. Now it's Paul Ryan, but at the time. And they wanted to do the same thing. Hey, you got a Democrat running the tax committee in one chamber, Republican running the tax committee, and the only way you're going to do tax reform is everybody jumps off the cliff together. So they write this blueprint, and literally, Harry Reid and Schumer told Democrats to back off of it and don't touch it, and John Boehner and the House Republicans told everybody to stay away from it, and Baucus and Upton were on their own. And they couldn't get it done, and because leadership has too much power. And this is another conclusion that Fukuyama makes, which is one of the problems we have is the two political parties are too powerful, and they're too evenly divided. And when you're this evenly divided, think about it in anything, then you're afraid of giving. Because if you give an inch, the other side is going to take a foot and use it for their advantage, right? Everything becomes leverage. And you watch it now, right? It's how the U.S. Senate is working. Or not, whatever you want to call that, working. It's how Congress works, where there's this, it's this fear of giving any side a little bit, because everybody's trying to preserve power. And when you look, the leaders of the parties, those four leaders of Congress, they're elected to do one of two things: keep power or get power. They're not rewarded by their fellow members for a lot of legislation getting done or whatever it is. They're only rewarded whether they successfully lead the party to keeping power. And so when you've made Congress top down, then you have then empowered only a small group of people. And then, of course, it comes back to what I talked about earlier with the interest groups. But that gets us to the other reason for, I think, that the other problem that we have of polarization, and that's us. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was common that Republicans married Democrats, Democrats and Republicans lived next door to each other. I know, it's insane, right? Some of my parents canceled each other's vote out. My grandparents canceled each other's vote out. You find out later, right? Grandma whispers, yes, I always voted for him. I always voted for Stevenson, Your grandfather was an Eisenhower guy, that type of thing. But it was sort of the norm, right? And there was this idea that we didn't let political parties sort of define us culturally. And I think I think one of the reasons why we struggle to come to compromise and why the leaders struggle to come to compromise is we've allowed our political identities to define us culturally a little bit and define who we are in a way that it used to be just sort of in the abstract, and it was, by the way, okay to agree with the other side. We now, and you can see it in polling, if you put an idea out there and you don't put party next to it, you'll get a mix of response from Republicans and Democrats on an idea. You say President Obama is proposing X, and automatically Democrats have an 80% approval of it, Republicans have an 80% of disapproval of it. And it could be the exact same idea, but if you put his name on it, and it worked the same way with Bush, it worked the same way with sort of the second term of Clinton. That's when you really started to see this happen. And we've gotten to where we sort ourselves out. We're only talking to ourselves. We only watch one cable channel on one side of the aisle, or we only watch one cable channel on the other side of the aisle. We're not having these conversations with the other. I mean, it really is as if Democrats are from Venus, Republicans are from Mars, and the rest of us are stuck here on Earth. By the way, red planet, blue planet, do you get it? Yeah, see? Yeah. And by the way, they do need the relationship book too. That would help. You just got to learn to listen, right now. And so we're in this situation where I think we've sorted ourselves out. The two parties are so defined now. They let sort of party define themselves so much ideologically, too much in a cultural sense, and it makes it so that you don't we don't have this perception of listening. And then you look at sort of how campaigns are conducted now. You know, one of to me the big problems, one of the problems of this sort is, and why it was easier to have, I think, this bipartisanship of 20 or 30 years ago is there used to be diversity inside the two parties ideologically. You know, you had your Rockefeller Republicans and your Goldwater Republicans, and they were all in the same party. And you had the conservative Southern Democrats and the Midwest Progressive Democrats in the same party. And the different coalitions would work with each other at any one time. And maybe the Rockefeller Republicans and the Progressive Democrats were over here. But there was always a perception, there was always a way of putting together bipartisan coalition. Well, now everybody is allowed ideology and party to sort themselves into the same blocks, so you don't have this easy way to sort of mix. And I'm sure some of you sit there and go, yeah, I always get a lot of people tell me I'm a fiscal conservative and a social liberal or something like that. I don't know which party represents me anymore, type of thing. And I don't think either party wants you. You know, I mean, I have to say this. I don't think any party wants you anymore. You know, or they'll tell you they do over here if you write them a check, but they won't say it publicly. And this is this is where I think the two parties don't realize that they've bought into this idea of what I've just described, that party is identity, is culture, is sort of now culturally driven, and that you don't need to persuade anymore. You know, I think one of the biggest downsides to big data has been how political strategists have used it for bad. So big data and this ability now to take all this wonderful data we have, it's been great for healthcare. I think it's been great for, you know, studying diseases. It's been certainly good for business in many ways. It's terrible in politics because the two parties have used it to simply identify only more of their one side. You know, it used to be we conducted campaigns with the assumption of 40% is for you, 40% is against you, and the fight is for the 20 in the middle. And you fought to fight them and you fought to persuade them to your side. Now the running conventional wisdom among the two parties is there are no swing voters that swing between two parties. There are just voters that swing between voting and not voting. And so your job is to figure out how to motivate your passive members of your party, of your tribe, of your coalition. So Democrats will, you know, look for different issues to motivate unmotivated parts of their coalition to find their 50% plus one. Republicans will do the same. And in, you know, for instance, I've noticed in October of election years now, the two nominees for whatever race it is, governor, Senate, president, they're not even talking about the same issues. Instead, they're doing micro-targeting to whatever constituency group they feel like they have to remotivate. Well, what's the unintended consequence of that? That means you believe you've won your election based on just getting the support of your tribe. So when you go to govern and to legislate, you don't feel as if you have to compromise. In fact, you worry if you compromise, you'll get punished. Because your coalition, if you don't stick to what you promised you would do, your coalition will punish you, perhaps in a primary. And, you know, we've lost the reward structure for the middle. And so, look, I think there are ways of some interesting political experiments out there that are trying to bring back the swing voter or bring back the perception of the swing voter. California, I don't know how many of you are from California, but they now have a system that is trying to get rid of primaries, party primaries. So everybody's on the ballot together in the primary, and the top two, regardless of party, meet in the general election. Here's the potential upside of something like this. Let's say you have a 70% a congressional district that voted 70% for Obama. Well, it's likely the top two that advance to the general election are both Democrats. Well, now, to win a general election, who do those two Democrats got to appeal to? Those 30% of Republicans who before, when you had sort of that one party, party primary where the primary did everything, suddenly that 30% never got talked to by that person running for it. And the same thing obviously would happen on a Republican side of this. And look, this was a Schwarzenegger reform. He was hoping that you'd see also the rise of more candidates willing to be independents, and realizing that it would be easier to run without a party label in a system like this. It's only 4 years old. We've only had a couple cycles with it. If it works, I think it'll mean that while you'll still have liberals and conservatives representing the deep Democratic districts and deep Republican districts, you're going to have a different style of legislator, right? One that realizes they got to balance their base, their issues with the political base, with some voters on the other side of the aisle who could punish them, and it hopefully will make them more pragmatic. You know, my frustration with the political system these days is the fact that nobody practices politics anymore, right? The whole point of politics is the art of the possible. But our politicians don't actually do it anymore, right? They just, it is all about principles, and everybody's, you know, everybody should have a set of principles. There's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, if you stick to your principles and don't get anything, then what are you there for? It's something that, we don't conduct our own lives that way. You know, I was like, imagine if we conducted ourselves politically the way Congress the way sort of the two parties conduct themselves now. You know, if a neighbor's dog is pooping on my yard, you know, I'm not like going to start a super PAC and start advertising in the neighborhood and shaming the person from, you know, I'm going to try little things to persuade them to pick up, you know, maybe I'll come out and going, hey, Jane, how you doing? And it's like, hey, do you need a baggie? I saw you forgot your baggies, or something like that, right? You know, you practice some politics because you want to live in a neighborhood where you're not yelling at each other all the time. And so we do it in our own lives, and yet we sort of are letting our politicians no longer practice politics anymore. And in fact, they get punished if they do it, right? They get punished if they work across the aisle. They get punished if that happens. And it's part of the, I think, the reform that needs to take place. Look, I think there's some structural things we have to do. The gerrymandering thing is an issue. In fact, if I were the Republican Party, I would have to look at myself in the mirror and gerrymandering. I think their issue, you know, as America changes, becomes more diverse, the Republican Party should want to have constituents that represent more of America. And what gerrymandering does is they're sort of postponing their issues. So they're drawing political districts that are easier to win, they're whiter, they're drawing out the diversity. And then they wonder why Hispanics, who maybe 40% of Hispanics identify themselves as conservatives, but only 20% are even thinking about voting for the Republican Party. Well, because the Republicans starting in Congress haven't even wanted them to be their constituents. They've like proactively gone out. And so, first of all, I think they would go a long way, the Republican Party would go a long way of solving some of its problems on the diversity front by wanting to have a more diverse constituency. But it also, I think the more competitive congressional districts we have, the better. I mean, we're down, out of 435 races, we're down to literally 40 that are sort of swing districts. And that means the swing, there just isn't enough that the middle of the electorate that are susceptible to swing voters. And so whatever we do to reform, my theory is it's got to be done through the mindset of how do you have more voters feel as if they have skin in the game in that election, whatever it takes. If it's this getting rid of party primaries, that's one thing. You can do what the state of Iowa does and try to draw, they have 4 districts, they try to draw the 4 most competitive districts that they can within geographic reality. And by the way, Iowans, for the most part, seem to send fairly members that usually do work well with each other, and we'll see what California ends up sending. But it is, you know, this is something that I think we've got to figure out how to fix that system. And by the way, the public is responding to the two parties in a very negative way. Ever since the debt ceiling, one of the things that's been happening, the first debt ceiling debacle in 2011, which is, when you think about it, basically Washington decided to put the fragile economy and to decide, let's play politics with it. And ever since that moment, voter turnout has been going down in any kind of election we've had in this country. We went 20 years, basically, where voter turnout was gradually going up, with the big peak in 2008. But every year you saw real voter turnout, even by percentages of the population, actually basically edging up after what was a down period, sort of Watergate and Vietnam sort of started a period of where it went down, and then starting in about 92 with Ross Perot, it started moving up again. And then we had the debt ceiling. The 2012 presidential election, voter turnout was down. LA mayor had the lowest turnout in 70 years. They were electing a new mayor. New Jersey governor had one of its lowest in like 50 years. In 2014, we had voter turnout, a 70-year low for a midterm election. And this one really gets me because we spent more money than ever before on a midterm election. Now imagine running a business and you're selling your widgets and you sold less widgets than you ever had before, but you spent a record amount of marketing, record amount on advertising, and you spent more on marketing. What would you say to yourself? I got a widget problem. I certainly let people know, but nobody wants to buy my widget. I got a widget problem. I got to fix the product. The two political parties, they spent more money than ever before and fewer people showed up. They have a widget problem. The public is rejecting what they're selling. Okay, so Republicans won in a low turnout. Democrats won in a turnout that was lower in 2012 than 2008. But the fastest growing political party in this country is no party, registered independent. If you can, the states where there's registering by independent or no party, it has now surpassed one of the two major parties in most of those states, where one of the two major parties is actually third on the list. And in a few states, registered independence is 1, and the two parties are 2 and 3. I think there's a whole vast middle. You feel it. There's this disaffection that's out there. They know the system is broken, and they're losing faith in it. And, I've talked about different reform ideas that you could possibly have. Ultimately, and maybe you need a massive disruption. The closest thing we got was 1992. Ross Perot, in some ways, was a massive disruption to the political system. And what did it do? It engaged more of the public. Voter turnout went up. And by the way, both parties sort of reformed themselves in some ways. And suddenly Bill Clinton was never talking about the debt and deficit. And then he got into office and focused on the debt and deficit. The Republican Party was not a very populist party circa 1992. And after Ross Perot, it sort of decided we've got to be a little more of a populist party. And so both parties used that, realized how scary it was that this independent candidacy could threaten their political power. And they reformed themselves. In this days, it's sort of like the two parties need Ubering. And we need Ubering really badly. Disruptive force. And where it comes from, I don't have a good thought. I mean, I think that the fact of the matter is we don't like CEOs the way we used to like them. Remember, it used to be in the 80s and 90s we thought, Lee Iacocca would make a great president, or the Ross Perots of the world. But now we don't have there isn't that good feeling about corporate America these days as we used to have. Even military leadership, there's some flaw, it's not like David Petraeus is seen as a high moral guy anymore and things like that. So we don't have that same feeling. So I don't know where this comes from. I just know that the public, if this person shows up, the public will respond. The two parties, I worry about how the public's going to respond if we hand them Bush and Clinton. I think this is going to send it's not fair in some ways. If they were Hillary Smith and Jeb Jones, I could argue these are exactly the type of people you want to see running for the presidency. I think they're very highly intelligent people. I think they could do Lincoln Douglas debates, meaning without a moderator and go on their own. I think they're that gifted and talented. They certainly are they know a lot. But I think the message we would send by going Clinton and Bush is that, it's who you know that matters. It's what family you belong to, and I think it drives turnout down, and I think it leads to more sort of cynicism to the system. That's not good. And the thing is I'm going to end on this note, because my one piece of hope on sort of reforming the political system is about this new generation, is about the millennials. And I say this for a couple reasons. Generations, there's a couple of theories on how and there's one running theory out there that basically we have a rotation of 4 generations, and you have different generations. Every 4th generation is the generation that sort of fixes our problems, right? The greatest generation was that. And it all depends on what happened in their formative years. This is a very long way of me explaining that the baby boomers really screwed up the country. But anyway, I'll get to that in a minute. You can't blame us and Gen X. Baby boomers didn't have enough of us. There's already more millennials in the workforce than there are Gen X. But if you think about what the millennials went through in their formative years, two giant things happened: 9/11 and the Great Recession. The only other generation in our recent history that went through something similar was the greatest generation, the Depression era, the Great Depression and World War II. And what came out of them, right? What is it, when Tom Brokaw dubbed them the greatest generation, and in many ways it wasn't just about getting us through the Depression or getting us through World War II, it was also building the middle class, right? Building America's suburbs. The modern American suburbs today, in some ways, basically built by this class. It was sort of redefining sort of America for the 20th century. And one thing about, there's sort of plenty of things that sort of, I think, had an interesting impact on the greatest generation. But I look at the stories my grandmother would tell, and she lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Chicago, and she shared a bedroom at any one time with 3 or 4 different kids. One was her brother, and the other would be the kids of whatever family needed someplace to stay, right? It could be an immigrant cousin family, whatever it was. And that was common. That was common. So, and of course she said as a kid you hated it, but it instilled a sense of community. I think what's interesting about this millennial generation is, as cynical as they are, I think, about the political process and about us in the media and distrust that they have for big this and big that. Think about the new innovative, the sharing economy that has basically been created by the millennials. In many ways, it's a sense of community. They're less materialistic because of the Great Recession. They're living, they don't need cars. They don't feel like, so they're trying to move close in. Again, sort of, the idea of they saw their parents weren't living within their means, and they realized, oh, you need to live within your means. Look at things like Airbnb. Airbnb is while they have distrust of big things, Airbnb wouldn't work if you didn't have a social network that you trusted. So they have a sense of community. They're impatient, which frankly, good. I'm impatient. I'm a little done with sort of how Washington works. So I think they could end up being a very positive force in sort of that generation that, just like the greatest generation, that sort of helps us reset. Because that's really what we need, right? We need a reset in our political system. I think we need a reset in sort of how the economy, how we fit in the global economy. And we need a reset in sort of how we fit when it comes to sort of the world, international, how we exert ourselves as a superpower. So as pessimistic as I sounded for 95% of my talk, I do want to end that, help us millennial generation. You're our only hope. So with that, I will stop, and we'll start a little Q&A. I think we're going to go right into it.
Thank you.